means, working out all the logistics for these meetings and getting everybody on board. And then last but not least, to the candidates, Mr. Strahl's here with us. These candidates have put forth an extraordinary amount of effort over the last few months, and we certainly want to acknowledge and appreciate their effort and commitment to this process. With that being said, everyone, this is David Strahl. Other than that, Gary, I'll turn it right over to you. Thank you.
Okay. Let's we're running, since we're on our clock. Well, why don't we get started? Mr. Strahl, I got a series of questions for you to start.
Okay.
And then we'll have some other follow-up questions, I'm certain, from the alderman. So first question, how would you describe your approach to managing people?
My approach to managing people is defining expectations for them and helping them understand what is expected of them. I allow my managers to manage because that's what I pay them to do. I also want input and collaboration to, alternative viewpoints are fine, and I encourage those because I think it's important that we explore various options before we come to a conclusion. So I want to make sure that everyone understands what I'm trying to achieve and work with them to achieve that, because when we define expectations together, it's better for the organization. So I am pretty comfortable looking at alternative viewpoints and encouraging alternative viewpoints. But once we've decided on a direction, that's the direction the group is going to go.
Okay. Have you ever had to deal with a staff member or a department head that appeared to be underperforming in the position that they were in?
Yes, I have. A lot of that has to do with making sure.
I got you to say yes. Let me tell you the rest of the story.
I assume you're going to want to know what I did. So.
Yeah, how did you go about addressing it, and what steps you take?
I try to meet with my management team at least once a month, so I communicate with them what expectations are. They've had some evaluation process also, so that regular meeting helps update me on what they're doing. So when we get to the point where if there is an issue, that it's not a surprise. We have discussed it. If there's something they're not going to meet, we know that ahead of time. We try to change our direction to do what we can. I want to make sure they have all the tools necessary to achieve what we had agreed to achieve. And if ultimately they don't meet those thresholds that we have established together, then I encourage them to go and look for another position.
Okay. Do you have any particular ethical philosophy that you utilize?
Well, obviously, I follow the ICMA Code of Ethics because I think that's the cornerstone of our profession. So from that, I internalize those ethical standards and follow those to make sure that I'm doing the best job that I can in a apolitical, I guess, informational exchange the best I can. I obviously am not going to play politics. I want to give the best information to the board in terms of data and analysis so they can make the most informed decision possible. So from an ethical standpoint, if I feel that there is an ethical line that I'm getting close to, or I feel there's an ethical issue that the elected officials should be aware of, I will share that with them and advise them what my concerns are regarding that ethical issue.
Have you actually had an opportunity to where you've had to deal with that in your career with ethical issues?
Yes, unfortunately, in a situation where we had my previous boss had some issues, and I tried to advise him of those concerns from a professional standpoint, and unfortunately didn't take my advice, and I tried to help him, I guess, understand the train was coming down the tracks and how to try to address that. Unfortunately, he didn't listen, and I was left kind of cleaning up the pieces at the end and working with the elected officials in a severance package on his behalf.
Okay. in your career, have you supervised or managed public safety departments in an organization?
Yes. And
What's your experience been?
in the organizations that I've been in as city administrator, village manager, and even as assistant, I've worked with the department directors to define their goals and expectations, work with them on developing their budget, and also help them develop performance measures so that people understood what their activities and what the value that they added to the organization was. So obviously I've been involved in labor negotiations in those organizations directly, so I understand the ramifications of dealing with employees and working through the necessary attributes of managing employees in those different environments. They're a little different from the general employee population, so I'm cognizant of what those issues are, and make sure that they are the cornerstone of most organizations, because they're the ones that people see most often. So it's important that the community have a reasonable understanding as to what the value that they are, and that they have a level of integrity that they reinforce. And part of my goal is to give them tools to make sure that that is achieved.
Okay. My next question, kind of along similar kinds of lines. Currently, many cities are examining, policing policies overall. Have you, in your career, undertaken or recommended reorganization or change efforts in public safety and policing in your career?
I worked with our police chief and a previous agency about strengthening our community policing efforts. Part of that is making sure that the communication, the connection that the police have with the community is just not going out and responding to calls. They have to connect with them on different levels. So I worked with them on looking for those opportunities. One area was I worked with one of the police officers in developing a simple parking solution for a multifamily area. And when we worked together and brought the necessary people in to discuss this problem and come up with a solution, it was amazing how people embraced that as to this is something that, the collaboration between the community representatives and the police department to solve that particular issue. And they were very receptive to that. And they said, hey, this is something we haven't been able to solve, and you guys step forward to do that. And they were very appreciative of that. So yeah, I've been involved in those kind of things through community policing efforts. In terms of reorganizations of departments, again, I look to the professionals, and I ask a lot of questions in terms of what the operation is doing, how they can justify the things that they do. If there are serious concerns as to what the level of performance that the officers are doing, because one of the things I ask my police department on a regular basis is, what are they doing with their undesignated time? There's a certain amount of time that they go and respond to calls, and then what are they doing with the rest of the time that we're paying them? Are they, initiating contacts? Are they, checking doorknobs? What are they doing with that additional time? So I look for that information from the chief, police chief in particular, as to what they're actually doing beyond just answering calls all the time.
Okay. How would you go about recommending or making changes in policing in the current environment nationally, and would you?
I think part of the current environment, from what I have observed and kind of internalized more than anything else, is I think some of the reaction to the police department is a soundbite type of reaction. I think that if you've got a good relationship with your police department and the community, that's going to show. And there is no doubt in my mind that, based on the cuts in funding for social services, that the police officers are kind of the last line of defense. They're the only ones out there interacting with these people. So there is a need to at least try to address that aspect of it, because they're really not trained to deal with those situations. So I think that there is a broader community aspect in terms of what the police can do, interacting with social workers, whether they work for the city or they work for another agency, to assist people that have been identified that have those particular needs, I think is critical in terms of making that connection with the community.
Okay. Have you ever been involved in the preparation of an operating and a capital improvement budget? And can you tell us about the process you've used in your role?
Sure. From an operating budget, I have been involved in putting together a budget in every agency I've worked in, including or incorporating elements of a strategic plan, performance measures, and also feedback from citizens through citizen surveys. Because I think that's a three-legged element that we need to make sure that is communicated through the budget. I also look at the budget as a valuable communication tool for the citizens to know what we're spending their money on, why we're spending their money, and what they're getting in terms of benefit from spending that money. Are we achieving the goals and objectives that they have communicated to the community, and how we're going, and if we're doing a good job at that. So I look at making sure the budget is something that the average person can understand through, whether it's an executive summary, with some charts and graphs, and shows exactly what's going on, that's easy to follow, because nobody understands what fund accounting is. So it is our job to show the citizens where the money goes and why it goes where it goes. From a capital improvement standpoint, yes, I've been involved in that also. I think it's important to have a justification for what those capital items are and a prioritization of what the capital projects are. And then because to me, capital projects are kind of the long-term, here's what's coming down the pike, here's what we can afford, here's the prioritization based on what we think we can do this year. If something needs to be moved on based on what the finances are or what the objectives are, then that has to be that flexibility. But the justification as to why you're undertaking that capital improvement is important to be included in the budget as part of that process. And obviously, for any capital project budget to be successful, we need to have a separate funding source so you don't drain or utilize general funds if you possibly can, in terms of trying to keep that money flowing.
Okay. In your career, have you been involved in reorganization or right sizing an organization? Could you tell us about it?
Yes, I have. During the last economic downturn, we in 2008, 2009, we eliminated some positions. We contracted out for some positions. We changed kind of our focus on a number of activities. But part of that process was we went through like a process improvement review of all the activities and a number of services that we provided. So we wanted to streamline those as much as possible. What we found, there were a lot of extra steps, and there may have been some other involvement of employees that were extraneous to the process itself. So we eliminated those. So we made sure the services were as efficient as possible before we got to that level of affecting employees' lives. So if people could be reassigned as to what we needed to make sure that was accomplished or what was a priority from the elected official standpoint, we made sure that we had the personnel to do that without trying to cut services. One of the other aspects of that is that we prioritized what the service levels from the elected officials, what they wanted as to, what was a must-have, what was a nice-to-have, and what we would like to have in terms of categorizing those service levels. And then we assigned costs to those service levels. So if something was going to be modified, they knew exactly how much that cost was if there was a change in that service level. So as those discussions go on, we have the opportunity to say, oh, well, don't think that service is necessary anymore. Okay, well, it cost X, and it, in terms of whether it's personnel or other overhead costs related to the service delivery.
What you learned from the process going through that?
It's not a pleasant process to eliminate people's jobs.
In your mind, what's been your track record as it relates to growth in government in your role as a manager or administrator?
When you say growth in government, are you talking about expanded service delivery or just additional employees to provide the service levels?
Additional employees, I think, to provide service.
I guess this kind of circles back a little bit to when I mentioned the performance measures. when you can't just, document output in terms of number of contacts. There's got to be some kind of a cost element attached to that. So you know what that cost is to provide that service. So when you reach a certain threshold that you can't absorb that service delivery anymore with the personnel that you have, you know that. So you can move forward to the next level of what that tipping point is for additional personnel. If there are technology solutions to try to expand or leverage the personnel that you have, I think that's important to go through that process also. But the most important thing when you expand those services, they have to be tied to what the value of that additional person is going to add to the organization or the service itself. Just and making sure that there's agreed to metrics that is used consistently to make that determination. Because I have told my department directors several times, like, how do you know when you need more people? You have to give me some empirical evidence as to what that threshold is going to be. And I've worked with them to try to develop what those are. So there's while professional opinion from your professional managers is important, I want you to understand why we're coming to that conclusion with some backup material as to why it's necessary to ask for that additional personnel.
Okay. How have you been able to develop collaborative relationships in order to work together with the board or the commission?
Well, a lot of it has to do with understanding their priorities and expectations, communicating what's going on in terms of real time, what's coming down the pike, and what is a long-term effort. So making sure that those are all kind of meshed together in terms of how it works from a decision standpoint. So one of the things that I would do is to reach out to the individual elected officials to understand what their priorities are, and then how that fits in with the overall organizational objectives. Because I can only follow what the majority said, what the majority decides. I can't follow 13 different directions because it's not realistic. So trying to get some prioritization as to what those elements are in terms of direction and what we can achieve as a community, I think is important. So that was one of the steps that I would want to do, is to go through that process and develop it into a strategic plan at some point with true roadmap and action elements related to that. I think the worst thing that people do sometimes is they create a strategic plan and then they park it on the shelf and they never touch it again. It's an active document. It's an active element that needs to be kept live and in the forefront of people's decision making.
Some of what you just were talking about kind of leads me to another question that I actually had for a little bit later. I'm assuming you've had an opportunity to help an organization develop a vision and goals for that organization.
Yes.
Could you explain
several different organizations?
Could you explain the process?
Actually, I ended up, once we did it internally with staff, and twice I've done it with a facilitator. So while working it with staff was an interesting experience, I thought we got more value out of it using a facilitator, because they could come in and really call the question sometimes and try to force people to come to a conclusion or a consensus, versus just everybody throws everything in all at once and there's really no direction. It's just, okay, we've put all these elements into the soup, but we don't know what our goal is going to be and what the soup's supposed to taste like. So I worked with the facilitators from start to finish, bringing them in, get them a lay of the land, and then help develop the plan, bring it to the elected officials for their input, and then making sure that the elements, again, to me, a strategic plan is you establish a goal, and then there's milestones along the way that you're going to determine if you're working toward that goal or not. So I will work with the facilitator to make sure those little milestones along the way are something that's included in the decision making and in the programs that we work with as staff and we provide to the elected officials in terms of getting their direction and input and achieving those, so they know if we're progressing toward those individual goals or not.
Okay. Mayor, did you want to ask your question now?
Not necessarily. If you're at a good pause, that's fine. If you're on a good roll, if you want to continue, that's fine.
Well, I figured if it relates to where we're at,
It sort of does. A couple questions ago, David, if you could tell us a little bit about your experience supervising and managing public safety employees.
Well, I have not directly managed them. I've worked with the department directors in managing them through, again, making sure that there's goals and objectives related to what their activities are, to understand what they're doing out in the field, understanding the value that they're adding to the organization and the community. So in terms of understanding what their duties are and how they apply to what they're providing to the community, I think I'm pretty well versed in that. And working with the department directors to make sure that we can measure what those activities are is one of the things that I've been involved in.
Okay, you have supervised fire chiefs and police chiefs.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Gary. Thank you, David.
yes, sir. Okay, my next question. In your career, have you been involved in economic and community development efforts in your communities you worked in?
Yes, I have.
Tell us about how you would go about developing a plan to strengthen economic and community development in Hendersonville.
Well, I think it's important that there's a comprehensive plan that gives some direction as to what the goals and objectives of the community are in terms of where they want to go in the future. And again, that probably could be an offshoot of a strategic plan. But at the same time, understanding what they want to focus on, what they want to try to achieve, you know, if it's going to be more industrial, multifamily, more single family, and then where those most likely elements are going to be established within the community. And of course, the infrastructure is obviously important too. From an economic development standpoint, to make sure that the community is placed in a position that is unique. You know, people know that they're in Hendersonville versus somewhere else in the metro area. I think it's important to have a true brand as to what is different in Hendersonville versus another community, and why the community can offer more than in another community, and that comes back to branding. At the same time, when somebody does come in and wants to develop something in the community, I want the process to be as seamless as possible. So we're upfront about what elements they need to follow, if there are issues that they need to be aware of going through the process, and to streamline the permit process as much as possible so that there are no serious roadblocks. And if there are concerns, they're aware of that early on. And making sure that everybody on staff is, hey, this is a project that obviously the elected officials are supportive of, or the Planning and Zoning Commission may be supportive of, that we want to make sure is successful in the community.
Okay. Let me start that again. Have you ever had to deal with managing staff in a period of conflict? And what's your approach to dealing with that conflict?
Would that be conflict among staff or conflict out in the community that staff is responding to?
Yes.
Both. I have dealt with both, you know, unfortunately, in the time that I've been in municipal management. In terms of dealing with conflict, I've worked with a department director and a subordinate to try to address what both concerns are. They just didn't like each other. They thought each other were trying to get one up on each other. And I brought them in separately, and I basically said, what seems to be the problem, define what the issue is. And I worked with them pretty well in trying to cool the situation down, because I basically said, you guys got to figure out how to work together, because if you want me to come in and solve this problem, both of you are not going to like the solution, versus I'm not going to take one side versus the other. But you have to be adults and professionals about it. And here's the expectations of how I want you to work together. And ultimately, you know, if it affects the organization, I'm going to have to make the call that something's going to have to happen. But ultimately, I'm going to work with them to try to solve that issue. I tell people all the time, you don't necessarily have to be friends at work, but you do have to be professionals, and you probably have to work together. So I think that's important that people understand what they're at work for. In terms of conflict out in the community, A lot of that, in my mind, is communication. Define expectations for people in terms of what the community is going to provide to them, of what service that they can expect in terms of what you're going to do in terms of that service level. For example, we had a long-term power outage in the community I worked in for a while, and the utility company was given updates that were not accurate, and we knew they weren't accurate. So we basically came out with a whole separate press release and communication to the citizens that basically said, do not listen to the utility. You know, this is a long-term situation. This is at least more than 72 hours, adjust your life accordingly. And people were very appreciative of that, because then they could plan their lives around that versus, oh, well, it's going to be on in 24 hours. Then when that doesn't happen, then what are they going to do next? So I thought that was important to make sure that we communicate what those expectations are early on and often if possible.
Okay. Have you ever been involved in a situation where you had to try to persuade individuals to change their position or positions or support an unpopular decision? And can you tell us about that?
I think it depends. Part of that depends on who that is. If it's elected officials, I'm going to present the information and you can decide what you want to do based on that information. So I'm not necessarily going to lobby to try to get a consensus or a majority opinion. I think the backup that we provide in terms of recommendation should stand on its own, and you can decide whether that information helps make your decision or not. But I don't think from a staff standpoint, that may be a different situation, because I'm going to look for consensus wherever I can, but I also am going to encourage alternative viewpoints to make sure that I've covered as many bases as possible before a conclusion is made. So at the same time, if I feel that it's an unpopular situation, I think it's important to identify that and what the ramifications of why that's unpopular or what we need to be aware of going through that decision process to come to some conclusion one way or another. So, sometimes you just can't change people's mind, and admitting that is one of the major steps to achieving what needs to be accomplished from an organizational standpoint also.
Have you ever had to address a morale problem with employees? If you have, could you tell us about a specific situation and your approach to resolving it?
A lot of times the morale problems that I'm confronted with are during labor negotiations, surprisingly enough. Many times the union representatives will come to me and say, hey, morale's a problem. And surprisingly enough, what's the financial impact of what that morale is one of the questions that we have to explore. But I think generally from a morale standpoint, people want to understand how they fit into the organization and that their labor is valuable to the organization. So I think regular feedback, defining expectations, and letting them know that they are important to the organizations are critical to have that buy-in from the organization. Because I think, people don't go into municipal government to get rich. They have deeper values, and is why they want to get into municipal government. So understanding how that connects with the community and how that connects with, serving others is something that, sometimes they have to be reminded of, but at the same time, the value that they add to the community has to be acknowledged. And there are different techniques for that, whether it's a regular recognition opportunity for doing something extraordinary, or if it's service awards. And generally acknowledging what people are doing, I think it helps a lot. So I have been involved in developing those programs and utilizing different, usually it's not always financial, but there's different recognition opportunities because a lot of people, if people are generally just recognized for what they're doing, a lot of times they're happy with that.
Okay. What would you do if the city's board of mayor and aldermen adopted a policy with which you disagreed?
Well, I would communicate to them why I felt that there was a concern with it, and they're the decision makers. I only present advice and recommendations.
Okay. In your view, what's the most important aspect of the city administrator's job?
I think one of the most important elements is to be out in the community, to understand what's going on in the community, to provide meaningful, documented, and data research information for elected officials so they can make the best informed decisions they possibly can. So from my standpoint, I want to make sure that I give you the data, the analysis, the recommendation based on that analysis. So when they're going through this decision process, they're looking at the same information that we put together. So they should be able to come to the same conclusion that recommendation is, because it's supported well from a staff standpoint in terms of what that recommendation is. So that, I think that is important in terms of what my role is, to provide the best information possible so they can make the best decisions possible.
What changes do you think local government must make in order to be more effective in the next 5 to 10 years?
I think they need to understand and reinforce that relationship with the citizens. Unfortunately, the only way that service is delivered is through taxes or some form of revenue generation. So understanding what those expectations are from the citizens and what can be delivered with the investment that they're providing is important. And that, again, that circles back to the performance measures that I talked about before, because if we can't show what we're using their dollars for and what the value of those dollars are in terms of service delivery, it's going to be awfully hard to strengthen that relationship when we do have to have a revenue enhancement or a revenue adjustment. So I think that having that constant information out there and to be able to show on a regular basis what we're doing with their money and why, and what traction we're getting with that, and making sure that from a best practices standpoint, that if you invest in Hendersonville as a taxpayer, you're going to get full value of that investment. And we can document that and show that.
Okay. So how does this job fit into your career path?
Well,
Stay here.
I have had an interest in moving to that area for quite a while. It fits from my professional and personal work balance aspect of it. I want to be involved in a growing community, and being a first full-time appointed city administrator in a position, there's a certain legacy and a professional attraction to that in my mind, because you're creating a lot of things that will come after that in my mind, and that's exciting. And to lay the groundwork for things that come after me, I think is also exciting from my standpoint. My daughter has also expressed an interest to go to grad school in Nashville, so that could work out really well from that standpoint too.
Okay. My last question for you. What's the one thing about you that the Board of Mayor and Aldermen need to know about you prior to you leaving today?
Well, I think that people, I think, look at me as probably a serious person, which I am. I'm serious about this profession. I'm serious about representing the community, working with citizens, taking the time to answer the questions and to explain decision-making to citizens if they inquire. At the same time, I also am a relaxed person. I spend a lot of time listening, so I don't necessarily am the first one to speak up, but I take it all in and make sure that when I do speak, I add something of value to the discussion. So I think the strength that I can bring is something that is somewhat intangible, but at the same time, I know what my role is, and I'm comfortable with what that role is in terms of making the city better.
Okay. I know, I think several of our Board of Mayor and Aldermen have some questions, probably have some questions. Alderman Woodcock, I understand you had a question you'd like to ask.
Yes, thank you. First, I want to start off by apologizing for missing you the other day. Between the meetings running late and not feeling well, I couldn't stay, so I do apologize for not meeting you face to face. You mentioned having an issue with the utility. I assume that was an independent utility outside of the city or your control.
Yes, that was a electric utility, ComEd. It's one of the larger ones in the metro area in Chicago.
How were you able to know they were providing inaccurate information, and why did you feel you needed to update your systems with different information?
Because they kept failing to meet deadlines, and we were in an emergency operations center component at that point, and we knew that they were not meeting because we knew how bad things were out in the field, because it was basically a straight line wind that knocked down, a lot of trees. It's an unbelievable amount of trees, so a lot of power lines came down. So they ended up bringing in crews from out of state eventually, but we knew this was going to be a long-term event, and they were too optimistic about when they were going to get this back up. And it was kind of interesting. From this adventure, we actually worked with them to change the whole emergency protocol and create a different system of communication to the citizens and the municipalities going forward because of this experience. And I was involved in changing that protocol with them, because I told them all along from the beginning, it's like, it is not our responsibility to communicate what your service level is, but people are calling the municipality because you're not answering phone calls. So that is not our job, but we're going to give them accurate information because you're not stepping up to the plate. And we communicated that to them on a regular. They didn't like hearing that, but after hammering on them for quite a while, they actually understood what we were trying to get to and changed their mode of operations accordingly after the fact. And it's actually worked out pretty well since then. We've had a couple different storms like that, but not the power out as long, but the communication efforts have improved significantly from that adventure.
Thank you. I cannot imagine how you could have answered that any better. So I appreciate it. Thank you.
Anybody else have questions at this time?
I have a question.
Yeah.
You mean to go ahead?
Yes, sir.
Okay, Mr. Strahl, I appreciate your interest in Hendersonville and your time in this. I have a question. Have you ever suggested a tax increase to any city or county board who you've served?
Yes.
When was that?
Well, sometimes it's part of the budget. Sometimes it is targeted for a specific service. Like, for example, when I was on the Fallon, we set aside specific money for street improvements, for example. So we basically included that in the budget and had identified the portion of a certain tax increase to go toward that activity. So we made sure that if there was an increase, that there was some value added to that, or there was some tangible results of what that tax was going toward. And I think that's important a lot of times from the citizen standpoint, that if there is a tax increase, it's something that they can see. Unfortunately, sometimes you build a lot of stuff underground they don't necessarily see, but in that respect, I think it's important to make sure that for an infrastructure standpoint, that you tie whatever you're doing in terms of a tax increase if necessary, to make sure that we cover what needs to be accomplished. Sometimes the tax increase is just for general operations too, because the cost of government goes up, and you want to try to minimize those increases. So you just cover what is absolutely necessary from that standpoint.
Well, how many times have you suggested a tax increase? It sounded like you had suggested that multiple times.
I haven't really kept a count, but I have suggested a couple times, and not all of them get approved. Just the nature of the business. But again, from my standpoint, is if I'm going to recommend a potential revenue change, it's going to be tied to something that, again, is critical to the community, in my opinion, or it's related to some kind of tangible asset that is necessary, that needs to be funded.
Okay, thank you. I have one more question. You kind of hit on this before. Would you ever try to micromanage the police and fire chiefs, or would you, or really any department head, or would you just let them do their jobs?
Well, I specifically do not micromanage those departments or a lot of other departments. I feel that it is my job to hire the best people to manage those departments, give them the tools to manage, hold them accountable for managing those departments. And then if there are operational things, they're the experts in that. But I'm going to ask questions so I understand what needs to be done or what they're trying to accomplish and why. Because I guess the best way to kind of define that in my mind is I kind of consider myself as a conductor, where I know how the music should be played together from all the departments, but I don't necessarily know how to play every instrument in that department, for example. So I look to them to be the experts in those operations. But again, I'm going to ask questions so I understand, because eventually somebody may ask me, whether it's one of you or it's a citizen. So we need to make sure that we, again, show value of what that investment in those services are and define that for the people that are paying the freight.
Okay, thank you, sir.
You're welcome.
Alderman Cunningham, you have a question?
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Strahl.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure to meet you last week. Enjoyed our conversation. As you know, my focus is finances. And one of the most important votes that we take all year is assembling and, well, actually approving the budget. And your main job responsibility in that aspect is to prepare and to present us the budget for the new fiscal year. Question number one is, what kind of process do you use to do that, or will you use to do that? And how collaborative will you be with the department heads, especially our first responders, to make sure that they have the tools and the services and the training that they require to keep themselves safe and to keep the community safe? And lastly, how would you balance the budget? And if you could answer those questions, thank you.
I may have to ask you to repeat some of those, since that's a three-part question. I'll make sure I want to cover everything.
All right. The process,
Sure.
the first responders, and now I forget the last one, the balancing the budget.
Well, let me start from the back end, balancing the budget. I think it's my responsibility as the administrator to present a balanced budget to you. And that process to present a balanced budget is a collaborative effort with myself and the department directors to work through what the priorities that you have set in terms of how the service delivery is going to be done, the cost of that service delivery, and then how we're going to provide that service based on the revenues and the money that we have available. So I think that's important to make sure that we look at what your priorities are in terms of what that service delivery, and present a balanced budget to show what, if we can work within those means or not. And if there's going to be a service change or there's a service modification based on the money available, we have to communicate that to you also. From a public safety standpoint, there are certain, I guess, elements or certain components of every public safety budget that are pretty much either mandated or they're safety related. I think from my standpoint, and I've done this in several agencies when we've gone through the budgets, like, I go to the directors and say, hey, you need to cut X amount of %. I understand that that's going to be difficult, but at the same time, we're on the same page, because I know enough about the operation that there are mandated training, there's mandated components to keep the employees safe and to making sure that we can respond as necessary as to how we need to follow those mandates, and it costs money to follow those mandates. You know, very seldom do anyone give us money to follow a mandate. They just, you know, pass it down, and we have to figure out how to do that. So I think those elements kind of become sacred. And while we can try to, from an administrative standpoint, we try to look for efficiencies and trying to address those mandates the best way we can, but ultimately they're going to have to be followed. So, you know, there's going to be a certain element and certain costs associated with following those mandates. It's out of our hands, you know, until that mandate is changed or that element is changed, there's not a whole lot we can do about it. So that becomes kind of the baseline with that budget, and then we build from there. So I think if I answered all of your questions.
Yeah, and just one quick follow-up. You and I come from the highest taxed states in the whole country. And we've had this discussion. I'm very sensitive to increasing taxes. How would you manage that process? Because we don't want to put an extra burden on the taxpayer. And I know we're in pretty tumultuous times right now with the COVID and all that, not knowing exactly what where the revenues are going to land. So we've taken a pretty conservative approach to that. How would you manage that?
Well, I agree that we're in very difficult times. We've done some dramatic budget changes in my agency also to try to get through this. You know, part of it is we just don't know the unknown. We're just trying to get through today, so hoping things will start to get better over time. So a lot of things have been put on hold, and we're just trying to provide the services that are necessary at this point and cut back on things that are, I guess, like to haves, but they're not essential for the organization. So we've tried to work within our parameters. And you might find this kind of interesting. Yes, I come from an extremely high tax state, and in my mind, there are way too many hands in people's pockets up here, and there's too much government. And so they're supporting way too much than they need to. So, and there's a lot of overlap, but I've seen this firsthand for way too many years. But at the same time, when you don't need that many levels of government, you don't tax as much, but at the same time, service delivery costs money. It's, you know, a lot of times people don't make that connection as to, oh, well, you know, they don't like paying taxes. Of course not. But at the same time, if we show what that value is for that investment in terms of those tax dollars going to something that they can see, some service improvement or something that makes a difference that we can point to, I think that will help them understand why they're being taxed to begin with. And ultimately, if something has to change in terms of a tax increase because something is related to that, explain it. Why, if there's a new mandate, or if there's something that we have to increase taxes to cover a certain service, take the time to explain it to them. It's no big mystery. I think it's critical to explain why the government needs more money sometimes.
Very difficult. Thank you very much, David.
Gary, do you see Steve Brown's hand?
No, sir, I didn't.
I think Alderman Brown is next.
Oh, Mr. Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Jekyll. David, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming last week, spending some time with us. I've got a question I'll let you address however you'd like to extrapolate on that. You, in your resume, you have in the past 4 years worked for 3 different places. I have 2 questions there. One of those reasons for departure was a mutual agreement or mutual discussion with you and supervisors, I believe it was. And I'll let you, however you want to address that, that's fine. The second question is, your present position is interim village manager. Why in the past 18 months has not been made village manager?
Well, that's pretty, I guess the best way to put that is they have offered that to me, but they can't pay me what the going rate is in that area. So it's cheaper for them to pay me at the interim rate under contract than as a full-time employee. So I'm functioning as the village manager, and it's just the title because I'm working under contract with a third party agency. to provide that service to them.
Okay.
If the previous agency before O'Fallon, I worked at for 23 years. I had kind of alluded to that before. My village manager had some issues. He ended up leaving. They brought in a new village manager. 6 months after he was there, he decided to bring in his own people. And since I had been there 23 years, I was not his own people. So he decided to go in a different direction. And I ended up with a severance package from the municipality, which I was not under contract and they were not obligated to provide one to me. So I took the package and looked for another position.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Do we have anyone else that wants to ask a question? Sorry.
I'm sorry, Gary, Alderman Waters and Alderman Robertson both have their hands up.
Well, let's have Mr. Waters go first.
Jim, we can't hear you.
Flip this. You almost have flip again.
You unmuted yourself and then remuted yourself. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
Can you hear me now?
There you go. You're good.
That's old country boy. I can't get hold of this stuff, but that's okay. Dave, welcome to Hendersonville.
Thank you.
Your past history, has it been as a manager or has it been as a city administrator or both?
Well, as assistant village manager and then city administrator, and then right now I'm a village manager, interim village manager.
Okay, are you saying you're a city manager now?
Well, in Illinois, there's cities and villages. It depends on how the community is organized.
Okay.
So it's still a city, but they call it village manager because the elected officials are all elected at large versus wards.
How long were you a CA?
Just a year.
How long?
A year.
A year, okay. There where you are now?
No, in O'Fallon. I've been 18 months in the current agency.
Okay. Are you a member of the ICMA?
35 years, yes.
You are?
Yes.
Good, okay. One question and I'll leave it. This is what we confront every day just about here in our town. But how would you handle a situation where service, like paving, like trash, like drainage, just to name a few, was affecting our citizens in different wards? How would you handle that problem?
Well, from the drainage aspect of it, I would want to find out what the problem was, and that may include some engineering efforts to determine what the problem is and if there are potential solutions, so we can apply some costs to those potential solutions. Again, you mentioned garbage. I watched the garbage meeting this afternoon. I feel for you about the problems that you're having. We actually are switching garbage providers August 4th to a new provider in Schiller Park. And our transition was a lot smoother than yours, unfortunately for you, or fortunately for us, unfortunately for you guys. So what was the first element that you were talking about?
Well, we have a problem with our paving. We have a problem. Go ahead. Excuse me, go ahead.
Well, the problem with paving and keeping up with paving is you always have to go after the worst first. And there's a certain element, there's a certain degradation of paving, and that's really built into what those paving ratings are. If you fall behind on those, if you're not doing the class 5s right away, or the class 4s, they're going to get to class 5s pretty quickly. So you need to make sure that those don't fall behind. It's expensive to keep up with paving. There's no doubt about it. And you're going to have to devote a certain amount of money to that every year to try to keep up on it. Because once you fall behind, instead of just resurfacing, then you get into rebuilding, then it gets exponentially more expensive. So
you're saying the right words, I tell you, because we got some roads that's really in bad shape, and I know what you're talking about. I guess I was shocked when you just mentioned the trash companies that y'all are hearing about our problems down here, way up there. So that tells you how bad it's been. But outside of that, Dave, that's all I have. And thank you, Mr. Jekyll. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you.
Someone else had wanted to ask a question.
Alderman Robertson was next.
Robertson, sorry.
Dave, thanks again for being here. Good job.
Thank you.
I'd like to ask you, I think
Hey,
it's
Alderman Robertson, again, we're having a hard time hearing you. You're like 50% volume right now.
okay. I'll speak up. Is that better?
There you go. That is better.
Yes.
Okay. I think it's real important for the board and the CA to have a good working relationship. So what ways do you believe that the CA and the board can use to facilitate team building and build cohesion between the board and the CA?
Well, one of the first things is understand what your priorities are and expectations of myself and the staff, so we can work out how that's going to be delivered. I think the other aspect of it is communication. I think that a lot of people don't necessarily see that as so critical, but it is. And in terms of what your priorities are and how those communicated to you and how we're progressing in terms of achieving those priorities is important. And I want to be able to give you information as like, hey, I haven't even asked for that yet, and that's important. That's great to know that's going on. So I look at one of the communication elements that I typically follow is try to give you some information on what's happening right now in terms of progress on particular projects, what's on the immediate horizon that's pretty soon coming down the pike, and then when it's going to start up, and then how long that's going to take, and then the long-term things that you should be aware of that may impact operations, may impact something that you have an interest in, just so you know kind of what's going on in terms of what staff's working on. So you can have an idea as to what we're all up to, whether it's including annual reports from various departments to know what they've been doing over the past year. Because again, part of that communication also filters down to the citizens, so they understand what everybody's doing also. One thing that is important that I think that is very helpful in terms of making sure that I am effective as a city administrator is I have to react to what the majority says. So while each individual person can communicate to me, I can't go in 13 different directions simultaneously, because I won't be able to be successful on your behalf when I'm doing that. So I would ask for consensus. I would ask for direction from the group, because that helps me direct my efforts in terms of working with staff to try to achieve the goals that you've established.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We've got Alderman Woodcock and Alderman Hayes with their hands up.
Alderman Hayes, give you a shot.
All righty. Thank you, Gary. Dave, good to see you again. It was great meeting you last week. Share with the board some of the things that you shared with me about the importance of good communication from the city.
Well, one of the things that I thought was important too, I didn't see it on your website, and I wasn't sure if you guys did this, but I didn't see like a community newsletter about communicating what's going on in the community as to what projects, what public works projects are underway, and letting people know what's going on. So they don't necessarily have to contact you as to, hey, when's my street going to be done? Or, why is this happening? Because that information can be out there and shared. Again, part of that is circling back to that budget too. That budget is a spending plan that shows what we're doing and in what we're spending the money for. So I think that's part of that communication to the citizens themselves. And I think making sure that you have you're armed with the information as to what's going on. So when people do, they do ask you the question, you can readily point to that and be able to readily tell them what's going on in terms of, well, I'll have to get back to you. while there's probably in a community this size, there's going to be some of that, but at the same time, if you're armed with that information, the best I can provide to you or the staff can provide to you, that'll help you also in answering those questions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Alderman Woodcock.
Thank you. Since we're wrapping up, I just wanted to take a moment to thank Gary and MTAS and city staff. I think despite what we read on Facebook and outside influence and even inside influence, you have delivered a great final product. We clearly have two great, very different, but all nonetheless great candidates, and I look forward to finishing this process. Thank you.
Anyone else?
Gary, we have Alderman Brown with his hand up. That might have been for earlier.
Alderman Brown? I guess.
Well, thank you.
Gallery view.
Dave, I want to ask you the same question that I asked Ms. Davis. You had a hard day at the office. Trash is not being picked up very well in the neighborhood, and we all understand that right now. Had employees not doing really what you think they need to do. You put in 10 hours and you went home. What do you do for relaxation? After a day like that, it might, maybe I don't want to know, but just in general, what do you do for relaxation?
I try to ride my bike as often as possible because that helps clear my head. That's a bicycle, not a motorcycle. So I try to do that as often as possible.
Don't make fun of motorcycle.
I'm not. I just
Jonathan's laughing too. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, I've never been able to figure out how to operate one of those. So the bicycle is about as complicated as I can get on the road.
Good. Everybody needs a release, so that's good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Alderman Hayes. Oh.
I just got my hand down. Thank you.
Anybody else want to take the opportunity to ask a question? If not, I don't hear anything.
It can't be that good that I've answered everybody's question. I don't believe that.
Dave, I want you to believe that, but at the same time, you got to realize we've been doing this for close to 3 hours.
At the end of the day, what has been a long day.
No doubt.
You're the best, Tina. Thank you.
Dave, I appreciate your spending time with the city of Hendersonville.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Everyone appreciates your interest and willingness to participate in the process. And I know it's been a long process because of circumstances with COVID to get from the start to the finish. And I think I can speak for a lot of folks that we're glad to be closer to the end than the start of it. And we appreciate your time and effort.
Thank you.
Dave, this is a public meeting. You're welcome to stay. I think we're going to talk for probably 30, maybe 45 seconds. Gary's going to update us, maybe tell us what the next steps are. We'll let Chris Taylor weigh in if he wants to. So Gary, anything else you want to throw at us?
Well, there probably, I think in terms of order of process, I know HR has already started in on some of the detail work that has to be done behind the scenes, in terms of, credit checks and drug screens and all those things that you want to have done behind the scenes for when you're going to hire someone. I think my hope would be that you have an opportunity to decide at your next board meeting, and I forget when that is.
That'll be next Tuesday, a week from tonight.
Okay. I got too many boards and too many meetings on my brain right now. That perhaps you'd have an opportunity to decide which person you want to move forward with. because I think then the next phase from that is to determine, have Dave and Mr. Bradley and Chris or someone work with whomever you all, if you have someone you want to offer the position to, have them work with out the details in terms of compensation and all the other details that go along with hiring this person. And have that come back to you all again for approval of whatever agreement they reach in terms of start time, compensation, and all those parts of the puzzle. Probably August, whenever that might be. That's kind of, and that's maybe optimistic, but I think in terms of process, I think it probably needs to go about that way for this to be smooth. It must be raining outside because I'm hearing thunder.
Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, can I ask Mr. Jekyll a question?
Sure.
Yes.
Mr. Jekyll, you mentioned about us bring this before the board at our next meeting. Then you said HR is going to do some research on their background, both of them. Will they have that into us before our next meeting?
That I'd have to talk to Mr. Taylor. I know they've already.
Yeah, these are details we can certainly work out. Typically, we don't shell out background checks to everybody on the board, but this is an unusual circumstance. So we will certainly put our heads together this week and communicate everything we need to do with the board prior to next Tuesday.
Okay, so we'll have all the information by next board meeting. Okay, thank y'all.
That's not technically what I said, but just for the record, but we will certainly be in touch.
Well, if we're going to make a decision next Tuesday, I feel like all the information needs to be available in our packets on Friday. If that's not possible, we need to figure out what to do then.
Well, we can't vote on it if we don't have the information.
Well,
Gary,
I think you could vote on it pending completion of the background stuff, as long as there aren't any red flags and I wouldn't envision there being red flags in either one of these candidates in terms of background checks and drug screens and all those things.
So we might be talking about two different things. Chris, I want to make sure, as far as any information that will help the board make a decision, I feel confident you can get that to us by Friday. As far as the background screening, the credit checks, very often we do that in the city after an offer has been made.
Yes.
That's correct. Most of the time, offers are contingent depending on drug screens and background checks. And the board typically does not see that type of stuff at any level because it's quite frankly unnecessary and there's HIPAA violations to be concerned about. So I think I think the most appropriate response to the group as a whole is we will certainly be in touch as soon as we put our heads together, maybe first thing in the morning, but I'm not sure we're going to get all this ironed out tonight, as it's been a long evening and the candidates are certainly tired as well. So.
What I don't want to happen is I don't want us to come to our meeting Tuesday night and be given additional information to help us make a decision. I think that's a little bit late. So I'm just making sure that if there is additional information to get to us, that can be done before Friday, but I don't anticipate any additional information.
I don't either.
Okay.
Mark has his hand up, Mayor.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Alderman Skidmore. Oh, we can't hear you, Mark.
You gotta unmute yourself first.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor, and thank you everybody for showing up tonight. My only concern, of course, it may not be a concern of you all, and that's fine if it's not, that voting on the person in a week's time without the actual process of each alderman thinking about this, I think is a little too soon. I think our next meeting, this is just me, we can vote next week, or we can bet the first meeting we have in August. But that's just my own. I think I don't want to extend it because that's a mistake. But at the same time, I want to make sure that we all have had the process to really think about this, because this is such an important decision to make for the future of our city. But it's certainly entirely up to you. I think next week is way too early. I think that the following meeting, I guess that will be the first meeting that we have in August. I don't even know when that is, actually. I hadn't even looked at the calendar to see when our next meeting is in August, but I think that's probably the proper time, because that's going to get everybody a nice time to think. It'll give our city and their staff enough time to look at and investigate the two candidates. I don't foresee anything crazy or, anything wild that we're going to go, oh my God, or anything like that on these two particular candidates. But I just think discretion is the better part of valor on this situation. It's such an important issue for the city of Hendersonville. So that would be my only voice in this. I appreciated both of them coming out or visiting with us again. I didn't speak a lot. In fact, I don't even think I spoke any, and I wouldn't have because I had already, it's my time to think now about it, but I'd already asked whatever I needed the first time I met them face to face. So, and their reactions of with those particular meetings. So that would be my only concern is, we don't want to jump the gun too early. I don't even know if Dave Lamar has got, if it even involves his the employment that he has with the city, and if it does, then I can understand why you all, then we would need as a city to get it done. But that would be something, I guess, that we would need to talk to Dave about if he could do it that long. But that's my position on it, folks. I mean, really. So that's just my 2 cents worth.
Alderman Skidmore, thank you. Alderman Brown, you have your hand up. I don't know, or Gary, do you want to respond to that?
One thought that does cross my mind, and I didn't ask either one of the candidates, but typically, in this situation, when someone's employed somewhere else currently, you generally are going to have to give that employer at least a minimum 30-day notice, sometimes 60-day notice or 45-day notice. That may be a factor in terms of schedules. I've not talked to Mr. Lamar about timeframes for him, but that it may wind up being a factor in terms of when someone's able to start versus not, and having a smooth transition from one person to the next would be really beneficial, to be honest, to the degree that you can. And I don't know what the schedule Mr. Lamar has with you all and if there are any deadlines at all, but it's something to think about and consider as a part of that decision-making process.
Gary, can I weigh in on that while I'm here?
Sure, go ahead.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mayor. After when Chris and I and Gary talked about this process, since COVID has kind of put us 2 to 3 months behind in the interview process and getting together and things like this, and we've come this far, we just thought it prudent to go ahead and move on next week, since we met the candidates and vote on the 2. What happens with them is that if we vote on the 28th and we have a 2-week period to talk about the contract agreement, arrangements, pay, things like that, and then we go back to the board on August 11th for you to confirm that. There's a confirmation of that contract or that agreement with that individual, whether it's Jane Doe or John Doe. Vote on the 28th, have 2 weeks to talk about the situation, what you're going to offer them, what they've agreed to. Then we come back to the board for another vote on, this is the offer on the table on the 11th. There could be, Mark, it could be a potential another meeting later down the road if there's not an agreement between the board and the.
Okay.
And then if say there is an agreement on August 11th, August the 12th, we notify the candidate that everything is great, everything's moving forward, and then they've got to move, sell a house, do this, do that. We're talking another 4 to 6, maybe 8 weeks. And so we're talking down the road, and y'all extended my contract through September 30th. So that puts us in that window, Mark, of getting close. So again, I'm here for the duration until we put this thing to sleep. Got 2 really good candidates, and I would just like to continue with the process so that they can make decisions of their family. They both have families, and school issues, and things like that. So, and relocation. So that's kind of where that Chris and I and Gary had talked about going with that process.
David, I appreciate that. Something I want to add real quickly is that I do think a member of this board should be involved once the board selects the candidate. I do think a member of this board should be involved in hammering out agreement with the candidate to bring back to the board. I'm the chairman of this board, and I feel like that should be me. That I should be involved once the board makes a decision on who to hire, that I should be part of the group that hammers out an agreement with that person on hiring and when they start. Mark, you want to go ahead? Alderman
Yes,
Skidmore.
I just wanted, thank you again. I just wanted to reiterate, let me back up than what I said. Dave, you've been remarkable. You've thought of everything. I didn't even think how far on down the line that you said that it would, and I appreciate that, because I didn't really think that, you know, I've been involved in hiring and letting go some people, you know, in the past. And so it was really in the, you know, in the business I was in, it was relatively easy. I did not really think about how the steps that need to be taken with regards to our government, because I don't know that we've ever done this. So I'll step back my comments. I think that if the board wants to do it, I'm in full support of that. That it will be, we make that suggestion next week of what we're going to do, because that's just the beginning of it. Now, after I heard all that, it's, my God, that's the beginning of it. Your work and our work as a board is just beginning even after that. So, so that's my only take on that, is that I would acquiesce to what the board wanted to do, you know, and not go another couple of weeks out, because there's a lot of stuff that still has to be done. So that's all I wanted to say on that issue.
Alderman, thank you, Alderman Skidmore. Alderman Brown.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. I do believe that we need to bring this before the board on the 28th. I think we've been out long enough. I pretty well did my due diligence, what I feel like I need to do, other than going over some of my notes tonight that I've made on both candidates, thinking about it, praying about it a little bit, and I'll be ready to pull the trigger on Tuesday night. But the one thing I'd like to clarify now, I don't know where Chris went. Tina needs to tell me why people move around on my screen all the time. I'd look at Chris Taylor up here and then it'd be over here. The mayor would be over here and it'd be down there. I don't understand that, but everybody moves around. I finally found Chris. Or whoever wants to weigh on this. I want us to decide tonight what information we're going to get in a packet Friday. I don't want that done through an email, because that will get all construed at who wants what, why we're going to get it. So I would ask what is normal and customary for the board to get after interviews. Gary, I guess you and our HR expert need to weigh in on that. What's the process there? And I have one more question after you all answer that.
I'll answer on behalf of the city. I mean, the board has everything I have on these 2 candidates. I mean, it's that simple. There's nothing else that's what I said earlier. There's nothing else that I'm expecting to turn over, because I don't have anything else, unless we're wanting to debate whether they get drug screen results and background check results. You know, the background checks might be one thing, but you know, Gary, I would love to weigh in to see what other cities do, because I certainly know our processes in Hendersonville. I have not gone through those yet as a department head, but love to hear what other organizations do.
Well, I think you don't finalize an agreement with the person you want to hire until you have all those component pieces in place. You can have a lot of, and most communities will have a lot of different things moving at the same time in terms of getting agreements in place, getting compensation figured out, other costs associated with somebody coming to the community to start a job. And simultaneously, you're going to have information coming in about background checks, drug screen results, a number of other things going on at the same time. At this point in time, I mean, you all have seen, I think, their resumes, you've talked to them. Some of you talked to them longer than others. And so you've got to, I mean, and you've got some time to think about it and pray about it. And what you're asking, what you're wanting to do is identify the person that you're most comfortable with trying to move forward in the process, and to see if there's an opportunity, if that person is still, after all of this, still wants to come to the city of Hendersonville.
Sure.
And you can reach an agreement of what that's going to take for them to come here. That's not a done deal by any stretch of the imagination, by the way. So that is sometimes where the stumbling blocks lie, is when we get to that last piece of this phase and we start talking about salary and compensation, benefits, and all those other things. And I will tell you, I've seen that before. So we're a long way off from being finished with this deal yet.
Alderman Bolt.
A minute, I got one more thing.
Go ahead, Alderman Brown.
I have part C of my question, or part B of my question. I think the first part got answered fairly well. So we really don't have, unless you come up with a bad background check or you come up with a bad drug screen or something, we really don't have a whole lot more information to get from you, do we, Chris? Chris?
Well, we've already done
There
the
is
background
zero
check.
information that
He's locked up. Okay. I can, but you weren't moving around on my screen. So I think I'm good.
There you go.
One more question for Gary.
I don't have
one more question for Gary.
Yes, sir.
Really would like to follow protocols all the way across on this, and I think everybody else would too. And I don't know what the protocol is. You're the professional. You've done this with other cities. Of the team that was discussed a few minutes ago, which was HR, the CA, I think yourself, and the mayor made that request to be part of that. I don't know if that's protocol or normal. I don't know if another alderman or the vice mayor, I don't know what that is, but I want to be uniform on what we do. If a uniform across the board is you three and the mayor, that's fine. If it's you three and somebody else, that's fine. But I don't really want to see, and I don't know what the protocols are, exceptions to the rule. So whatever that rule is, I'll accept. I just don't know what it is, but I would expect us to follow that, whatever the protocol is for the selection process. So, well, I guess that was more of a statement than it was a question. So.
Yeah, just so you all know, generally speaking, at this stage, if you pick someone to move forward with, generally speaking, the protocol is the HR person, the city attorney, and usually the mayor, and occasionally I will get involved in some of that conversation as well. That's not, I don't do that 100% of the time. but in some instances, I do get involved with that. But certainly, your HR person and your city attorney have to be involved. And I think it's most often it's the mayor who is participating in that process.
Okay.
Thank you, Alderman Brown. Alderman Bolt.
Yeah, I just concur with Dave Lamar. He did an excellent job of pointing that out and move forward. Alderman Brown, so I appreciate that. I would like to follow a protocol. I would have a pretty significant issue with the mayor being involved in the negotiation process. I think it's kind of a conflict of interest when you have somebody that's significantly against having a city administrator as being part of the process. So, maybe you'd have another person in there as well. I don't know what the process would be. Maybe that's a board decision. I don't know why a decision can't be hammered out, kind of how we've been doing it up to this point, and bring it to the board, and the board can either agree with it or not agree with it. But that would be my 2 cents worth. Thanks.
Alderman Bolt, why wouldn't it be a conflict for the person he's replacing to be on that committee? Because the person he's replacing has a financial interest. The longer that we go without replacing him, the longer that the interim would continue to make money. I don't think that's the case. I don't think that there's a conflict, but certainly seems to me there's a bigger conflict having our interim city administrator on that committee than having our mayor on that committee.
Well,
I think you'd agree.
If I can respond to that.
Oh, please.
That couldn't be more incorrect. Dave wants to get out of here. He's only the interim. We put him in there just for a very specific period of time. He'd tell you right off the bat, he's got no interest in staying any longer than he has to. I would think in your case, you made it pretty clear over and over and over and over and over and over, you don't want a city administrator. So I think that creates a conflict. We don't need to hash that out.
No, I think I need to remind you that I put on the agenda for last week that we could have picked a city administrator last week. I think it's time to move forward with this. And I think that I've made that very, very clear. The only time that I've caused any delays in this is when items need to be brought to this board to make a reasonable decision by the people who are elected. Do you feel that somebody elected should be on this committee to hammer out agreement, or only appointed people to hammer out agreement?
I don't know. I don't know the process there. So far, when we got down to the final 2, we didn't use elected people. And in that case, I think it moved quite a bit smoother. You start getting elected people involved in this, especially if there's more than one, then you're going to start, it's going to bog down the process significantly. And I don't think there's any reason to do that. So as quickly as we can move through that process, I think we're better off.
See, I very much agree. I think elected people should be involved in the later stage of this process, especially after the board makes a decision on which one to hire. I think that it makes sense to have a representative of the board, and also makes sense to have a person that's been elected by the people of the city, since they're the one paying the salary. Gary, you look like you want to weigh in a little bit.
Nope, I'm ready to go home.
Okay.
Okay.
I still see Alderman Skidmore's hand up. That might be from earlier. That might be something he wants to say now. The look on his face says nope.
Call it a night.
Okay. I see nobody else wishing to talk, so let's call it a night. So y'all have a good night. Gary, Chris, we don't need a motion. Gary, Chris, appreciate your time, and everybody appreciate your input tonight. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Tina.
Thanks, guys.